The sky falls silent the moment everything changes. Sky was perfectly clear above the private jet when Sundar Pichai glanced out of the small window. It was supposed to be a routine trip. Nothing more than a few hours to meet a group of young engineers in a small town in India where he grew up. He loved these trips, quiet and away from cameras, but this time something felt wrong. The engines hummed like always, but there was a strange smell in the cabin. Sharp, metallic. A steward walked past, his face tight, trying to look calm. Sundar noticed his hands trembling slightly as he reached for a phone on the wall. "Sir," the steward said quietly, "we might experience some turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelt." Sundar nodded politely, but his eyes narrowed when the man rushed to the cockpit instead of checking other passengers. And the smell, it grew stronger. 5 minutes later, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have encountered a technical issue. We will need to make an emergency landing." The words echoed through the cabin like thunder. Sundar's fingers tightened on the armrest. Outside, the horizon began to tilt. Conflict and emotion. The unexpected fourth plane descended too quickly. Bags flew from overhead bins. A child screamed somewhere behind him. Sundar felt his own heart pound against his ribs as the steward came running back. "There's smoke in the cargo hold," the man whispered, eyes wide now. "Something's wrong with the wiring. We can't control the left engine anymore." Smoke began to seep into the cabin. Sundar coughed. Panic rose like a wave around him. He thought about his family, his children's smiles, his wife waiting for him. But as others started shouting and crying, Sundar stayed still, watching, thinking. Then, quietly, he stood. He helped the steward calm down the woman in front of him. He comforted the child behind him. He handed his own water bottle to an old man coughing in the smoke, even as fear clawed at his own chest. He kept moving, kept helping. But then a sharp jolt threw everyone to the side. The jet lurched downward violently. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. The steward yelled, "Brace! Brace!" But Sundar heard only the roar of wind and the faint cracking of metal. Then everything went black. Suspense and unexpected turn one. Sundar opened his eyes. He was lying on grass. His ears rang. For a long moment, he thought he might be dreaming. Then he saw smoke rising into the sky. The plane lay in pieces across a field, and then he heard it. Faint cries. He pushed himself. Pain shot through his leg. His shirt was torn, and his hands were bloody. But the cries grew louder. People were still trapped. Sundar limped toward the wreckage. He saw a young boy pinned under a seat. He tried to lift it, but his strength failed him. Then he saw the steward crawling toward him, and together they freed the boy. "Help," the steward said, voice breaking. The cockpit, they ran or stumbled as fast as they could to the front. Part of the plane was crushed into the earth. But inside, he saw the pilot slumped, unconscious. He froze for just a second. Then he climbed in, pulling at the door. Flames licked the edges now. He didn't think about danger, only about saving them. With the steward's help, they dragged the pilots out just as the front burst into flames. The smoke was thicker now. The air burned his throat. He collapsed on his knees, coughing. But as the wind shifted, he saw something strange beyond the wreckage. In the distance, a figure stood, not moving, just watching. Deep emotional beat. Humility and fear. Sundar stared at the figure. It wore a long coat, dark against the green field. Something about it made his stomach turn cold. Then the figure slowly raised an arm and pointed not at the wreckage, but at Sundar himself. A shiver ran down his spine. He blinked, and the figure was gone. It a trick of smoke? Exhaustion? But something inside him whispered that this was only the beginning. As sirens wailed in the distance and the survivors huddled together. Sundar sat alone, staring at the spot where the figure had stood. His hand shook, not from cold, but from a quiet dread he could not name. He knew this was not just an accident. Cliffhanger years later, as rescuers led the group toward waiting ambulances, a man in a black suit approached Sundar silently. His face was blank, his voice even quieter than the steward's had been. "Mr. Pichai," the man said, There's something you need to see, now, before the others arrive. He handed Sundar a small, charred piece of metal. It was part the wreckage, but scratched into it deep. Deliberate were 5 words that made his breath catch. We've been waiting for you. The man in black met his eyes and said, this is only the start. And in the distance, under the blood-red sunset, Sundar thought he saw the figure again, watching, waiting, the quiet after the crash. The Viquet was eerily quiet now. The fire trucks had arrived. Red and white lights flashed against the darkening sky as rescuers carried the last of the passengers away from the wreckage. Smoke still curled upward, making the air smell sharp and bitter. Sundar stood apart from the others, clutching the strange piece of metal the man in black had handed him. It felt heavier than it looked, warm still from the flames, and the words scratched into it seemed to burn themselves into his mind. We've been waiting for you. He wanted to believe it was just a cruel prank, or maybe a strange coincidence. But deep down, he already knew it wasn't. It didn't feel like an accident anymore. It felt planned, deliberate. And when he looked up to ask the man in black where he'd found it, the man was gone, vanished, into the crowd without a sound, leaving only the faint imprint of his footsteps in the muddy ground. Sundar's hands trembled as he slipped a piece of metal into his pocket. Nearby, a paramedic called his name, urging him toward the ambulance. He followed silently, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, back on the field, back on the smoke, back on that figure he'd seen in the distance, pointing at him through the chaos. He didn't tell anyone what he'd seen. Not yet. He just climbed into the ambulance, sat quietly as they bandaged the cut on his head and checked his pulse, and stared at the horizon as the last light of day bled away. But when he looked back toward the wreckage one final time, he thought he saw the figure again. Closer now. Still. Watching questions with no answers. The hospital was small and crowded. Survivors lay in beds or slumped in chairs, their faces pale and shaken. Sundar sat alone in a corner room, staring at the plain white wall in front of him. Doctors came and went, asking him the usual questions. Are you dizzy? Can you feel your legs? Do you know what day it is? But he barely heard them dot in his pocket. His fingers kept touching the piece of metal. He couldn't stop thinking about it, about the man in black, about the figure in the field. He closed his eyes and tried to calm his thoughts. He told himself it was just shock. The mind plays tricks in moments like this, he thought. But as soon as he opened his eyes, he saw something that made his heart stop. On the wall, above the sink, someone had written in faint black letters, "You are not alone." He stumbled to his feet and rushed to the wall. He wiped at the letters with his sleeve, but they didn't fade. They were etched into the paint. He backed away slowly, his chest tightening. Then he heard a faint knock at the door. When he opened it, there was no one there, but on the floor lay a small envelope with his name written on it in neat, thin handwriting. His hand shook as he picked it up. Inside was a single scrap of paper. On it was another message. Midnight. Roof. Come alone. Respect and humility as the clock crept toward midnight. Sundar sat by the window, staring at the lights of the city. Below, he thought about his family again. His wife. His children. He wondered what they were doing now, if they were safe, if they knew yet about the crash. He wished more than anything to hear their voices. But something in his heart told him that calling them right now, involving them, could put them in danger too. He thought about the passengers he'd helped on the field. The boy he'd freed from under the seat. The old man he'd given his water to. He thought about how, even when fear had gripped his chest and smoke had filled his lungs, he couldn't just sit there and do nothing. He remembered the stewards, tearful eyes as they dragged the pilots out of the burning cockpit. And now, here he was again, faced with another choice. He could ignore the note. He could go to sleep and pretend none of this was happening. He already knew he wouldn't when the clock struck midnight. He slipped a piece of metal into his pocket, left his room quietly, and climbed the stairs. To the roof, the meeting roof was dark and empty, the city stretching out in silence below. Sundar shivered as a cold wind swept past him. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the faint hum of traffic far below. Then, from the shadows, the man in black appeared again. His footsteps made no sound. He stopped a few feet away, his face hidden under the brim of his hat. "You came," the man said, softly, his voice low and calm. Sundar swallowed. "Who are you?" he asked. "What do you want from me?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the question. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out another piece of metal, almost identical to the one Sundar carried. He held it up so the moonlight caught it. Scratched into this one were 4 words: "You have been chosen." Sundar took a step back, his heart pounding louder now. Chosen for what? He demanded. The man in black didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly extended the piece of metal toward Sundar. His gloved hand was steady, patient. Asterisk. "Everything you think you know," the man said finally, "is about to change." Sundar hesitated, then reached out and took the metal from him. The moment his fingers closed around it, a strange warmth spread through his hand. The man in black leaned closer then, his voice almost a whisper. "They're watching you now. Just as you watched them burn." A chill ran down Sundar's spine. "Who is watching me?" he asked. But the man in black stepped back into the shadows, fading until he was gone again. In his hand, the new piece of metal began to glow faintly, as though alive. Deep emotional beat, doubt and determination, and Sundar returned to his room. The world outside felt heavier somehow. He sat on the bed, both pieces of metal in his lap, staring at them under the thin light of the lamp. He felt a deep ache in his chest. Not just fear, but something else too. Doubt. Confusion. He'd spent his whole life believing that hard work, respect, and kindness could solve anything. And now he felt like a pawn in some unseen game he didn't understand. But as he stared at the metal pieces, his thoughts drifted back to the field. To the passengers' cries. To the look in the boy's eyes when he was freed from the wreckage. He thought about the figure pointing at him. He thought about the words etched into the first piece. "We've been waiting for you." Slowly, he tightened his hands around the metal and whispered to himself, "I don't know what this is, but I won't run." His voice sounded steadier than he felt. Asterisk the knock at the door just as he placed the metal pieces under his pillow and tried to lie down. There was another knock at the door. Sharp, urgent. He froze. For a long moment. He didn't move. Then, quietly, he stood and opened the door just a crack. On the other side was not the man in black this time, but the steward from the plane. His uniform was torn, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. And in his shaking hands, he held yet another piece of metal. "They know you've spoken to him," the steward whispered, glancing over his shoulder like he was being followed. "They're coming for you now." Before Sundar could even respond, the steward shoved the metal into his hand, stepped back, and vanished down the hall without another word. And when Sundar looked down at this third piece of metal, his breath caught in his throat, because this one didn't have a message scratched into it. Instead, it had a single symbol he'd never seen before, something that glowed faintly in the dark, like an eye surrounded by flames. And when he looked up again, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out. In the darkness, he heard footsteps approaching. Slow, deliberate. And then a voice, calm, deep, and unfamiliar, whispered from the shadows, "You should not have come here." Asterisk. The darkness comes alive. The hallway was swallowed in silence after the lights flickered and died. Sundar stood frozen, gripping the third piece of metal so tightly it dug into his palm. The strange symbol etched into it, a glowing eye surrounded by flames, seemed to pulse faintly in the darkness, casting an eerie light on the walls. He could feel the weight of the quiet pressing against his ears, every breath loud, every heartbeat echoing like footsteps on stone. And then the real footsteps began. Soft at first, measured, deliberate. They were not hurried like the stewards had been. They did not belong to someone running or fleeing. These were slow, steady, confident, and they were getting closer. Sundar backed up until his shoulder pressed against the cold doorframe of his room. His mind raced. He tried to think of anything to say, but his throat felt tight and dry. The steward's last words rang in his head like a warning bell. "They're coming for you now." And still the footsteps came closer, in the faint glow of the strange metal in his hand. He thought he saw a shadow move at the end of the hallway. Tall, broad, its edges sharp against the darkness. He swallowed and forced himself to speak. "Who's there?" His voice sounded smaller than he wanted it to. There was no answer. Only silence and the sound of leather shoes clicking softly on tile, and then another sound, a whisper. Faint, almost carried on the wind, but he heard it as clear as his own thoughts. "You were warned." Asterisk, the encounter wanted to run. But something inside him, maybe pride, maybe defiance, rooted him in place. He tightened his grip on the metal, its faint heat burning into his skin now, and he took one cautious step forward. "What do you want from me?" He called into the darkness. For a moment, the footsteps stopped. The hallway became deathly still. Then the figure stepped fully into the faint circle of light from the glowing metal. It was a man, or at least shaped like one, dressed entirely in black from head to toe. A long coat hung from his shoulders, and a dark scarf covered his lower face. But it was his eyes that made Sundar's breath catch. They were impossibly pale, almost white, and they glimmered faintly in the dark like a strange symbol on the metal. The man tilted his head, studying Sundar as if trying to decide something. Then he raised a single-gloved hand and extended it toward him. "Give it to me," the man said, his voice deep, quiet, but firm. Sundar stared at him. "Give what?" "Yes, The man pointed to the glowing metal in Sundar's hand. "That does not belong to you," he said. But Sundar shook his head slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the stranger. "If this doesn't belong to me," he said, his voice steadier now, "then why does it have my name on it?" The man's eyes narrowed, and in that silence, Sundar realized something. This figure wasn't expecting that response. For the first time, Sundar saw a faint crack in the stranger's calm. And then everything happened at once. The man lunged forward, his movements sharp and fast. The hallway seemed to twist around Sundar as he stumbled backward, gripping the metal tighter. The glowing symbol suddenly flared to life, filling the hallway with harsh, white light. The man recoiled as though burned, letting out a sound somewhere, between a hiss and a roar, and then he was gone. The light faded just as quickly, plunging the hallway back into darkness. Emotional depth, humility and fear. Sundar sank to his knees, his chest heaving, sweat clinging to his neck. The metal in his hand was warm now, almost too hot to touch, but he refused to let go. He stared down at it. The glowing symbol faint again, but still alive, and for the first time since the crash, fear gave way to something else. Resolve, whatever. This was whoever they were. He could not simply hand it over. He thought of the boy he had saved on the field, the old man he had helped, the pilots he had dragged from the burning cockpit. He thought of his own children waiting for him at home. And he thought of the figure in the field pointing at him. Silent and knowing, he whispered to himself, though his voice was barely a breath, "I won't let you take it." He didn't know who he was speaking to, the man in the shadows, the pale-eyed stranger, or something else entirely, but the words steadied his hands. Even as they trembled. Suspense and unexpected turn, the letter lights flickered back on without warning, and the hallway was empty. Sundar got to his feet, still gripping the metal tightly, and walked back into his room. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and he leaned against it, breathing heavily. On the bed, where he'd left the first two pieces of metal, there was now a sealed envelope. Cream-colored, heavy, with his name written in the same neat, thin handwriting as the note that had summoned him to the roof. He sat down slowly, staring at it for a long moment before breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The words were simple. "If you wish to survive, come to the railway station at dawn. Bring the pieces. Come alone." There was no signature. But at the bottom, someone had drawn the same strange symbol. The eye. Surrounded by flames? He read the words again and again, feeling the weight of them settle on his shoulders. Asterisk, deep emotional beat, doubt, and Kindness thought about ignoring the note, about calling the police, about getting on the first train out of the city, and disappearing. But then he thought about the steward, the fear in his eyes when he pressed the third piece of metal into Sundar's hand. About the man in black on the roof who had said, "They're watching you now." About the stranger in the hallway who had recoiled when the metal glowed. And most of all, he thought about the passengers who hadn't made it out of the crash. He couldn't just turn away. He gathered the 3 pieces of metal in his hands. They felt heavier now, as though they knew what was coming. He tucked them safely into his coat pocket and sat by the window for the rest of the night, staring at the horizon, waiting for the first light of dawn. Cliffhanger. The shadow at the station one morning finally came. Sundar slipped out of the hospital quietly. The streets were still empty, the air cool and damp with fog. He walked quickly, keeping his head down, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on his back. When he reached the railway station, the sun had barely risen. The platform was empty, the tracks stretching away into the mist. He stepped onto the platform and waited. After a few minutes, a faint rustle behind him made him turn. The man from the hallway, stood at the edge of the platform, pale eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. But he wasn't alone this time. Behind him, emerging from the fog, were 4 more figures dressed in black. Each of them moved with the same quiet confidence, their faces hidden, their presence heavy and suffocating. The first man took a step forward and spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Then the fog seemed to thicken, swallowing the tracks, the station, even the rising sun, until all that remained was the circle of strangers and the faint, flickering glow of the metal pieces in Sundar's pocket. The man raised a hand, and the others began to close in, silent and deliberate, their pale eyes fixed on him. And somewhere beyond the fog, a train whistle blew, long, low, and mournful. As the ground beneath him began to shake, Sundar took a deep breath, his heart pounding, as he whispered to himself one last time, "I won't run." And the fog swallowed him whole. Into the fog, the ground seemed to vanish beneath Sundar's feet the moment the fog swallowed him. It wasn't just that he couldn't see anymore. It was as if the world itself had dissolved. The platform, the tracks, the cold morning air, even the faint warmth of the rising sun, all of it was gone. He reached out instinctively, hoping to feel something solid, but his fingers met only emptiness. The fog was thick yet insubstantial, curling around him like smoke, cold and alive, slipping between his fingers as though it had a mind of its own. His breath came quicker now, and it hung in the air in front of him, only to vanish into the white like everything else. He took one careful step forward, then another, the metal pieces in his pockets suddenly feeling like anchors, pulling at him with a strange weight. Behind him, he could still hear the faint echo of the train whistle, but it was stretched now, distant, like it belonged to another lifetime. And then he heard the footsteps again, soft, deliberate, closing in. He spun around, searching, but the fog only thickened. Shadows moved just beyond his sight, tall and silent, circling him slowly. "Where am I?" Sundar called into the void, his voice cracking against the heavy silence. For a moment, there was no answer. Then a whisper came, so faint it might have been inside his own head. "You've crossed the threshold." The threshold words chilled him to his core. He didn't know what threshold meant, but he understood instinctively that there was no going back. He took another step forward, his shoes scraping against something hard now, stone, perhaps, and the fog shifted slightly, revealing a faint path beneath his feet. The path was narrow and cracked, winding through the endless white. He followed it cautiously, feeling the air grow colder with every step after what felt like hours. Though time no longer seemed to move normally, the fog began to thin. Shapes emerged ahead of him. Tall pillars, crumbling and ancient, rose on either side of the path. Faint symbols were carved into them, the same symbol that glowed on the piece of metal in his pocket. The eye surrounded by flames. As he walked between the pillars, he became aware of something strange. The silence wasn't complete anymore. Beneath it was a faint sound, like a heartbeat, steady and low, vibrating through the stones. Then he saw it. A vast archway stood at the end of The path, taller than anything he had ever seen, etched with countless symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. Beyond it, the fog churned and twisted, darker now, almost black, as though it held back something immense and dangerous. Waiting at the base of the arch was a figure he recognized immediately, the man in black. Kindness in the face of fear, Sundar stopped several paces away, keeping his eyes on the man. "You followed me here," the man said quietly, his pale eyes glinting faintly. "Most don't." Sundar swallowed hard but forced himself to speak. "I don't understand what you want from me. I don't even know what this place is." The man studied him for a long moment before answering. "You're here because you made a choice. Back there, on the field, when everyone else froze, you moved. You helped. You carried others when you could barely stand yourself. They noticed." The words struck something deep in Sundar's chest. He remembered the boy on the field, the way his small hand had clutched Sundar's sleeve as he pulled him free from the wreckage. "Who are they?" Sundar asked quietly. The man's expression hardened slightly. "You'll find out soon enough," he said. Then he gestured toward the archway. "But first, you must go through. And once you do, there's no turning back." Sundar looked at the archway. The air beyond it shimmered, heavy with an energy he couldn't name. Fear twisted in his stomach, but so did something else, a quiet determination. He thought again of his children, their faces bright in his memory. He thought of all the times in his life he'd chosen humility over pride, kindness over power. He straightened his back, lifted his chin, and said, "If this is what I have to do, then I'll do it." The man tilted his head slightly, something almost like respect passing through his pale eyes. "We'll see." He murmured. Suspense and unexpected turn. The gatekeeper Sundar took a step toward the archway. But as soon as he did, the air around it darkened further. The fog thickened, swirling violently. And then, slowly, deliberately, something began to emerge from the shadows beyond the arch. At first, it looked like another figure in black. But as it stepped fully into view, Sundar saw it was something else entirely. It was taller than the man in black by several feet, its body wrapped in long, tattered robes that floated above the stone floor. It is hidden under a hood, but its hands, if they could be called hands, were long and skeletal, each finger ending in a sharp, blackened claw. It raised its head slightly, and beneath the hood, Sundar glimpsed a pair of eyes that burned like white fire. The man in black spoke softly behind him, the gatekeeper. The creature's voice filled the air, then low and resonant, vibrating in his chest. "You carry what is not yours," it said. "Why?" Sundar tightened his grip on the pieces of metal in his pocket. "Because no one else would," he said simply. The gatekeeper tilted its head, as though considering his answer. Then it stretched out one long-clawed hand toward him, palm open. "Then give it to me," it said. But Sundar shook his head. "Not until I know what it means," he replied. The air seemed to grow colder. The fog roared around him like a storm. The gatekeeper's fiery eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Sundar felt true terror seep into his bones. "You will regret this," the creature whispered. Then it stepped aside, motioning him toward the archway, and Sundar understood. He had passed some kind of test. Deep emotional beat. Crossing the arch, he stood before the archway now. So close he could feel the strange heat emanating from it, the faint pull in his chest drawing him forward. He turned once to look at the man in black. "What happens when I go through?" Sundar asked. The man's expression was unreadable. "You'll see," he said softly. "But remember this, what you carry is more dangerous than you realize. Hold on to it too tightly, and it will consume you. Let it go too soon, and everything you've done will be for nothing." Sundar let the words sink in. Then, slowly, he nodded. He stepped forward. The fog parted just enough for him to pass through the archway. The air shimmered violently, and a strange, sharp light filled his vision. And then everything changed. The other cities stumbled as his feet found solid ground again. The fog was gone. He stood in the center of what looked like a vast hall, its walls carved from black stone that glowed faintly with the same symbols he'd seen before. But it wasn't empty. Hundreds no. Thousands of figures stood silently in the shadows, each with pale, glinting eyes fixed on him. Their presence was overwhelming, filling the space with a quiet, suffocating weight. And at the far end of the hall, high on a throne of stone and flame, sat another figure, taller, grander, more terrifying than the gatekeeper. Its eyes blazed. Brighter than all the others combined. The throne room fell silent as the figure leaned forward, its gaze locking onto Sundar. And then it spoke, its voice echoing through the vast space like thunder. You have brought it here. It said. Sundar felt the pieces of metal grow hot in his pocket. The figure rose from the throne, and the entire hall seemed to tremble as it took a step toward him. Now, it said, you must decide what it's worth to you. And before Sundar could speak, the ground beneath him cracked, and a brilliant light swallowed him whole. Asterisk, the light reveals everything. The light was blinding. Yet Sundar couldn't close his eyes. It poured over him, through him, filling every corner of his mind with sharp, unrelenting clarity. His chest tightened as memories flooded back, not just of the crash or the strange fog, but of things he had forgotten long ago. Moments from childhood, quiet afternoons with his mother, his first steps into a classroom, his awkward first speeches in a crowded hall. But the light went deeper than memory. It pulled at something more fundamental, something he couldn't quite name. It was as if the light itself was searching him, peeling away each layer of him, looking for something buried at the very center. He wanted to look away, to shut himself off from it, but he couldn't. And then the voice came again. You carry what does not belong to you. It boomed, echoing through the brightness. He tried to speak, but found his voice wouldn't come. His hands instinctively reached into his pocket, gripping the 3 pieces of metal that now burned hot in his palm. The light seemed to narrow then, focusing solely on the objects in his hand, and the voice thundered louder. You brought them here. Now you must choose. Asterisk, the choice of brightness faded slightly, and he realized he was standing once again in the vast hall. The figures in the shadows were closer now, their eyes glowing more intensely. The figure on the throne taller, larger than life stood. Before him, its eyes fixed firmly on Sundar's hands. Slowly, Sundar opened his palm, revealing the 3 pieces of metal. They no longer glowed faintly, but blazed now with strange energy, threads of white fire running through the etched symbols. The figure leaned closer, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Give them to me, the figure commanded. Asterisk. But Sundar hesitated. He thought of the steward on the plane, the way his hands had trembled as he passed Sundar the 3rd piece. He thought of the boy he had rescued, the old man he had comforted, the others whose lives he'd touched not by force, but by kindness. He looked up at the towering figure and found his voice at last. What happens if I do? He asked. For the first time, the figure on the throne seemed to falter, as though it hadn't expected the question. That is not yours to know, it said finally. Though its voice was quieter now, Sundar clenched his fist around the pieces, feeling their heat burn into his skin. Then I won't, he said simply. Gasps, soft and almost inaudible, rose from the shadows. The hall itself seemed to tremble at his words. The figure's eyes narrowed. You do not understand what you defy. It hissed. But Sundar straightened his back, his jaw set. Maybe not, he replied. But I know what I stand for. Asterisk what? We carry figure on the throne stepped back as though struck, and for the first time, Sundar noticed cracks running through the stone floor beneath them. He thought again about how he'd gotten here, not just the crash, but the choices that followed. The decision to stand, to help others, to keep moving even when fear clawed at him. He remembered every small act of kindness he'd ever offered, and he understood now what the pieces of metal truly were. They weren't merely objects. They were moments, pieces of himself, symbols of the choices he'd made when no one was watching. And somehow, that realization made them feel heavier and lighter at the same time. He looked down at his palm and saw that the 3 pieces had begun to merge. The fire between them weaving together like threads of light. The figure on the throne snarled, its voice cutting through the hall. If you refuse, it said, then you are no longer welcome here. The shadows around him began to shift and writhe, moving closer. Their eyes burned brighter, their forms taller and sharper. He could feel their presence pressing in, cold and suffocating, but he didn't flinch. Then I'll find my own way. He said softly, suspense and unexpected turn. The breaking moment the words left his mouth. The ground beneath him cracked. Open. The air erupted with a deafening sound, like stone shattering and fire roaring all at once. Light and darkness collided above him, and the three pieces of metal in his hand fused together completely, forming a single disc that blazed with impossible brilliance. He staggered backward as the throne cracked, sending pieces of stone tumbling to the floor. The figure on the throne let out a furious roar, its eyes flaring white-hot, and the shadows around Sundar surged forward. But the disc in his hand seemed to shield him. A faint circle of light forming at his feet that kept the shadows at bay. The voice came again, not the figure's voice this time, but something deeper, older, more familiar. The price has been paid, it said. The shadows froze. The figure on the throne stopped, its fiery eyes dimming. The disc in Sundar's hands pulsed once, then shattered into 1,000 points of light that rose into the air and vanished. And then silence fell. Deep emotional beat, the truth revealed one. Sundar opened his eyes again. He was no longer in the hall. He stood in the middle of an open field, the same field where the plane had crashed. Morning light spilled across the grass, and smoke still curled faintly from the wreckage in the distance, but the field was empty now. No rescuers, no passengers, no one. In his hand, the disc was gone, and yet he could still feel it inside him. It's warmth. Its quiet strength. Then a voice spoke behind him. He turned to see the man in black standing at the edge of the field, his pale eyes softer now, his hat in his hands. You chose, the man said quietly. What happens now? Sundar asked, his own voice steady, though his chest felt heavy. The man studied him for a long time before answering. Now you carry it, he said simply. What you built inside yourself cannot be taken away. It is yours. Always. The words settled over him like a quiet truth. He looked down at his hands, expecting them to shake, but they were still calm. He felt different somehow. Hold. But before he could ask another question, the man in black raised a hand, and the air began to shimmer around him. The returned. Shimmer grew brighter, and Sundar felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The field dissolved again, the light around him folding and bending. When it stopped, he found himself standing not in the field, but in a hospital room. And this time, the bed was occupied. He stepped closer and froze. There, lying unconscious, bandaged and pale, was himself. He stared, breathless, unable to move, as machines beeped quietly in the background. And then the figure in the bed opened its eyes, his own eyes, and smiled faintly. Welcome back, it whispered. Before everything went black. Waking in two worlds. First thing Sundar felt was the weight of his own breath, heavy and uneven, filling the quiet of the hospital room. His eyelids fluttered open, and the sterile white ceiling above him sharpened into focus. Machines beeped softly around him, their steady rhythm almost comforting, though his chest ached with every inhale. For a long moment he stayed still, staring at the ceiling, unsure if he was awake or still trapped in the strange, dreamlike world. He had stumbled through beyond the archway. Then he turned his head slightly and saw himself. The other Sundar sat in a chair by the window, perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap. His eyes glowed faintly, not bright or terrifying now, but warm, like embers left in a dying fire. He watched Sundar with quiet patience, and when Sundar opened his mouth to speak, the other shook his head gently, as though words were not necessary. Yet instead the other stood, walked to the foot of the bed, and placed 3 small, dark pieces of metal on the blanket. They no longer glowed, no longer burned, but their strange symbols were still etched clearly. Waiting, the other finally spoke, his voice soft, calm. These were never about the plane, or the crash, or even about them. They were about you. What? The pieces mean Sundar struggled to sit up, his body weak but his mind suddenly sharp. He stared at the pieces, then back at his quiet twin. I don't understand, he said, his voice hoarse. What was all that? The field, the fog, the throne. Was it real? The other Sundar smiled faintly, though there was something sad in his eyes. As real as the choices you've made. He answered. He picked up one of the pieces and held it out. This, he said, is the boy you pulled from the wreckage. The moment you ignored your fear to save someone smaller than you, you carried him before he could carry himself. He placed it back gently and picked up another. This, he continued, is the kindness you showed the old man. The water you shared when your own throat burned. The choice to see someone else's pain even when yours was louder. He set the second piece down and touched the third, lingering over it for a long time. And this, he said quietly, is the moment you chose to face them, when you could have hidden, but instead you walked into the fog. It was never about courage. It was about willingness. Willingness to bear what others would not. The words settled heavily in the room, and Sundar felt a lump rising in his throat. But why me? He asked finally, his voice almost breaking. I'm not. The other shook his head again, cutting him off. You were never chosen because you were strongest, he said. You were chosen because you carried others when no one asked you to. Because you never demanded that someone else go first. Emotional depth, humility, and resolution tears pricked at Sundar's eyes as he looked at the pieces, small and unassuming yet impossibly heavy with meaning. He thought back to all those moments, the fear in the boy's eyes. The trembling hands of the old man, the steward's whispered warning. All of them carried inside him now like quiet victories and quiet wounds. He reached out slowly and gathered the pieces into his palm. They no longer burned, but they warmed his hand softly, as though alive in some other way now. When he looked, the other Sundar was watching him with something like pride. They'll never tell you thank you, the other said. They'll never know what you gave. But it doesn't matter. You'll carry them anyway, because that is who you are. A long silence followed, but this time it was not heavy. It felt almost peaceful. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the other Sundar faded, his faint smile lingering in the air like smoke. Asterisk, suspense, an unexpected turn. The final visitor, just as the room seemed to settle. A quiet knock came at the door. Sundar turned his head, expecting perhaps a nurse or a doctor, but it was the steward. His uniform was clean now, his hands steady, his eyes calm but still watchful. He stepped inside and stood at the foot of the bed. It's done then, he said softly. Sundar nodded faintly, though he didn't fully understand what done meant. The steward glanced at the pieces of metal in his hand and nodded approvingly. Keep them? He said. Not everyone can. Then he reached into his own pocket and withdrew a small folded piece of paper. He placed it on the blanket and gave Sundar a quiet, respectful nod before turning and walking out, without another word. Was slightly trembling. Fingers. Sundar unfolded the paper. Inside was a single line, written in the same neat, thin handwriting as before. When it gets heavy. Remember, you're not carrying it alone. Asterisk the weight, and the gift tears finally spilled freely down Sundar's cheeks as he closed his fingers over the note. He thought of his children's faces again, his wife's quiet strength, the strangers he had saved without ever knowing their names.